Stem changers, obviously, in the title of what you do with the verbs, you change something to the stem. Today we're going to focus on just verbs that end in IR. That also happen to be stem changers. Okay. Yesterday we talked about verbs in the present tense. So let's see what happens with pedir, which is from your vocab, in the present tense. How do we conjugate it? What do we change it to? Good. So E to I change. And where do we make those changes?
In the boot.
In the boot. Good. So nosotros is always out. So pido, pides, pide, pedimos, piden. Obviously notice that we're using present tense endings, so this is in the present tense. What three kinds of stem changes do we have in the present tense? What three patterns or families? O to UE. E to IE. E to I. Remember that when we were looking at our charts yesterday, you only had 5 verbs that ended in IR that were E to IE. And then all of the verbs that were on the E to I column were IR verbs, or verbs that ended in IR. We make those changes for the present tense only in the boot or shoe. What's the difference between a boot or shoe?
The boot includes.
Boot goes all the way up, a little higher on the ankle part. And then shoe, something extra irregular about the O form. It may or may not change the stem on the boot or shoe, but verbs like decir and seguir that were on the E to I column, that were IR verbs, since we're talking about IR verbs today, then you have to remember the extra change in the O form. They both do change from E to I, decir digo, seguir sigo, and they're on the bottom part of your chart with your shoe verb. That's present tense. Now we're going to see what happens with the same verb in the preterite. But every time we switch tenses, what should we know? Conjugation changes, so your endings change. And do the same rules apply? New rules. So you'll not have any boot verbs or shoe verbs in the preterite. New tense, new set of rules. Okay. This is on page 42 in your textbook. If you want to look there, it tells you that we're only talking about verbs in the preterite tense that end in IR. So this only applies to IR verbs. So if you want to write a note to yourself that this will not apply to any ER or AR verbs, that might help you kind of narrow it down. Okay. So preter or past tense for the verb pedir. If you look on page 42 in your book, and if you look on your chart, it's also an E to I change. Pedir it still means to ask for an order. But if you conjugate it in the preter or past tense and use those endings, then it will be asked for or ordered. Top 3 conjugations are regular conjugations. Pedí, pediste, pedimos. No big deal. We know how to do that. We know how to use the preterite tense endings. But when we get to the bottom 2 forms, then we have an E to I change, but only on the bottom 2 forms. Don't forget your accents where they normally go, with the yo form, and the el, ao, usted form. Now you're using preterite endings. And if you look on page 42, it tells you that there's only 2 kinds of stem change that happens in the preterite for IR verbs. And those 2 kinds are O to U, not O to UE, just O to U. E to IE does not exist, but E to I. Does that happen in the boot? happens in the basement. I call it a basement because I found these lovely little boxes, which you see on your paper, that it looks like a little building, and it has a door, and the basement part is the bottom part. If you were to stay in theme with the shoe category, then you can call it flip-flop, you can call it the sole of your shoe, you can call it whatever you want to, as long as you know that they only make O to U and E to I changes only in the bottom two forms. You'll hear me call them basement. You can call them whatever. What happens if these verbs, or any verb that we deal with, happens to be a reflexive verb? What do we also have to worry about? How do we know a verb is reflexive? Ends in SE, so we would need to have your reflexive pronouns, me, te, se, nos, and se. And let me mention it now, because we're going to run into some of these. When we talk about the verb leer in the preterite, past tense, it made an I to Y change in the bottom two. So we could technically also call it a basement, but I don't want you to confuse it with this family of verbs. These are only IR verbs, so leer is already out because it's not an IR verb. And we're not going to have any I to Y changes because I'm going to show you, like the verb reírse, you're going to end up with a double I. And instead of doing the 3-vowel in a row thing, we're going to just drop one of those I's. So let me show you what that looks like. The verb reírse. If I ask you to conjugate it in the preterite, we have two things we have to worry about here. One, this is not on your paper yet. We'll get there. The verb reírse is reflexive, and it has an extra accent on the I on the infinitive form. First conjugation, no big deal. What would it be? Move your SE to the beginning. Which reflexive pronoun agrees with the O form? Me. Conjugate it. Drop your IR. Add your ending. And if we need to refresh our preterite endings. Okay. So, me, reí. Speaking of, for this section, are we going to worry about AR endings? Because we're only worrying about verbs that end in IR. Okay. So, me reí, no big deal. Te reíste, nos reímos. Regular conjugations, except for where you have the accent on the infinitive form. You're going to carry over the accents to the to form and the nosotros form, just like we had extra accents for the verb leer. But unlike the verb leer, if we were to conjugate this, first we have to deal with the reflexive se. Then we have to deal with the verb itself. Drop the IR. R, E. The E will change to an I because it's in the basement. So R-I. What's your ending that we need there? I-O. Does that look odd though?
Yes.
Okay. So that's why we're going to fix it. And we're just going to drop one of those I's. So it's not 3 vowels. No I to Y changes. Just drop one of the I's. You can't have 2 I's in a row. It sounds like you're going to stutter if you say it equal, because you pronounce every vowel. You don't join or blend your vowel sounds.
Is it really
Without the accent, yes. Good observation. Same thing will happen on the other basement side. It's going to end up with 2 I's. You're just going to drop one if you end up with 2 in a row like that. So, se creyeron. This is the only lonely one that doesn't get an accent. If I asked you to conjugate any verb in the present tense or in the preterite, do you think you could do it? There's a couple of things to keep in mind. If you're going to use present tense, obviously you're going to put the right present tense endings with those verbs. But if you're having to worry about stem changes also, where do you worry about stem changes in the present tense? Where you make those changes? In the boot or shoe. But in the preterite, obviously you're going to use preterite endings. Where will you worry about stem changes? In the basement. And since you only have two kinds of changes in the basement, O to U and E to I, it's easy to tell apart. If a verb has an E, and we're in the stem changing section of our test, then we know that we were worrying about changing it from E to I only in the basement. If we know it has an O, then it's not an O to UE change, it's just going to be an O to U change. Questions so far? Okay, let's practice a few. And again, today, for right now, we're focusing on just the preterite tense. Just for IR verbs. Okay. So the verb freír. Verb freír has an extra accent. What does that mean? Do you have an extra accent on the infinitive form? Freí is normally there, regular conjugation. Freíste and freímos are going to get extra accents just because the original verb, the infinitive, has an accent. And then what will happen at the bottom?
You get double I.
You do. So what happens when you have double I's? Drop one. Make sure that on that I, you have a dot. Everybody see my clown nose dot there? A little bit exaggerated. Accent is on the O because that's where it normally is for the ending. And then for the ellos, ellas, ustedes, or anything plural form, frieron, double I, drop one. No accent on that one, but extra accents right here. These two are normally there. If I were to ask you to look at your chart that you got yesterday, and look at your chart with new eyes. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Look at this chart as if you're not looking at it from the present tense. In the present tense, we had O to UE, E to I, E to I. Now we're looking at this chart with the perspective of trying to conjugate something in the preterite or past tense. You may want to jot down a note to yourself. This only occurs with IR verbs. So, do any of AR or ER verbs apply? No. There's a whole bunch we can cross out, or not worry about. Don't actually cross it out on your chart, because we're going to use it for the present tense. You have two to worry about here, two IR verbs. In the preterite, though, are they going to make O to UE changes? O to U. And where are they going to make those changes? Bottom two, in the basement. What if it happens to be an ER or an IR verb that is an E to IE boot, present tense verb? Now it's going to be an E to I, basement, preterite. So all these verbs that have IR in them will either make an E to I or an O to U change only in the basement, only for preterite verbs that end in IR. Everybody see how to look at the chart two different ways? Okay. Let's go back and do divertirse. Divertirse has the reflexive attached to it, so we have to worry about the reflexive. What do we do with it? How do we take care of that reflexive?
Put it in front and just depending on the right one.
So me, te, se, nos, and se. Then regular conjugations above the basement. Top three, regular endings for preterite tense. But when you get to the bottom two, it'll be What kind of change? Since preterite does not have any E to IE changes, you can only make an E to I change. So E to I on the bottom two. Don't forget your reflexives. If you are looking at your chart, where on your chart would divertirse be? For present tense, it'll be an E to IE change. But where do we make an E to IE change in the present tense?
Before this one, so call it plus one to the
In the boot shape. So if we were doing this verb in the present tense, and you don't have two E's there, I think that's what you were thinking about. There's just the one E. Change it E to IE in the boot shape. If it's present tense, and use present tense endings, but we're doing this now in the preterite, so we're using preterite endings and only changing E to I in the basic. Then servir. What happens with servir? E to I. Can only make E to I because there's no other change that it can make. Top three regular conjugations. Then bottom two, change E to I. If you were to look at your chart and do this from the present tense perspective, however, it's still an E to I change. But it's no longer going to be a basement E to I change. It would be a boot change if we were doing present tense for that verb. And then lastly, dormir has an O. What's the only change that it can make? O to U. O to UE doesn't exist in the preterite.
Wow. I'm sorry, guys.
It's okay. Top three conjugations are good. Regular conjugations, preterite endings, accents where they should be. In the basement, though, change your O to U. However, if we were doing this in the present tense, then it would be an O to UE change. But that change would occur inside the boot shape. Let me mention one last thing. With the verb freír, if you are doing the verb freír in the present tense, it's an E to I, boot change, and because the verb itself has an accent on the original, then you're going to have an accent on all the I's. That's present tense. If you're doing freír, which you have on your paper in the preterite, these two normally have accents. These two will be extra. So if you run into any verbs that have an accent on the original form, present tense, extra accents on all the I's, and change happens in the boot for the present tense. In the preterite, it's an E to I basement. So only two changes there for the stem. Accents normally there for the endings, extra accents. This one doesn't get one. So same thing will happen for sonreír and reír and any of the other ones. Keep in mind, as we're working with preterite, you're not going to worry about any AR or ER verbs, only verbs that end in IR. What I want you to do is look at the back of your paper. You have more boxes to fill in. I want you to try those on your own, then we'll check them.